He went on to embolden the Union cause with some of the most stirring words ever spoken. Lincoln was heading back to his seat before the photographer could open the shutter.
For almost 90 years, this photograph sat in a government storage box, mislabeled as a worthless crowd scene from the Civil War. Nobody studied it. Nobody even knew what it was. Then one archivist pulled the forgotten plate into the light, zoomed in on a single blurry face in that crowd, and instantly turned a nothing image into one of the most important photographs in American history.
I noticed something had changed when I was looking at this photo, not just of Seward looking away, but my eye drifted back and I went, wait, who is this?
Because he wasn't in the first.
He was not in the first photograph. So who is this?
And that was only the beginning, because when researchers later zoomed deep into a second set of plates from the exact same day, they found something that has historians openly fighting to this very moment. The forgotten plate. To understand how a face like that could simply vanish into a filing system, you have to understand what photography actually was in 1863. There were no rolls of film, no snapshots tucked into albums. A photograph was a sheet of glass coated in chemicals, exposed in a wooden box, and developed on the spot in a portable darkroom that smelled like ether and varnish. Each plate was heavy, fragile, and one of a kind. Break it, and the moment was gone forever. Matthew Brady was the most famous photographer in America during the Civil War. His name was on thousands of images, taken by him and by the small army of camera operators he employed and sent into the field. When the war ended, Brady was drowning in debt. He had bet his entire fortune on the idea that the government would buy his war archive, and for years, nobody did. He went bankrupt, waiting. Finally, in 1875, the War Department purchased a massive collection of Brady material. Thousands of glass plates went into government custody. And here is the part that matters. Nobody sat down and studied each one. There was no team of historians combing through every frame. The plates were cataloged, labeled, boxed, and stored. Some of those labels were wrong. Some were vague. Some described a plate so poorly that its real significance was invisible to anyone reading the index. One of those plates showed a crowd. Soldiers, civilians, boys milling around in the foreground, flags in the distance, a sea of hats stretching back toward a wooden platform. As far as the paperwork was concerned, it was just another crowd scene, a nothing image. In 1941, the Army transferred that collection to the National Archives in Washington. The crowd plate came along with everything else, still anonymous, still unremarkable. It had now been sitting in government hands for 66 years without anyone realizing what it actually was. Because that plate was exposed on November 19th, 1863, at Gettysburg. On the day Abraham Lincoln stood in front of that crowd and delivered a speech of roughly 2 minutes and roughly 272 words that would outlive every other speech in American history. And for nearly 90 years, the historical consensus was simple and sad. No photograph of Lincoln at Gettysburg existed. The most important 2 minutes of American oratory had left no visual record at all. That was the settled truth. Until the woman at the enlarger decided to test it. The woman who looked. Her name was Josephine Cobb. She joined the National Archives in 1936 and rose to become chief of the still photos section, which made her one of the people responsible for the mountain of Civil War glass sitting in federal storage. Cobb had a particular obsession, and colleagues remembered it clearly. She was drawn to hidden pictures, images people had never really seen, even when those images had been sitting in plain view for generations. She took on a project that sounds simple and was anything but. She began enlarging photographs from the Brady collection, plate by plate, to study what the small prints could not show. A glass negative holds far more detail than the human eye can pull from a contact print. Enlargement was like turning up the resolution on history itself. In 1952, Cobb was working with that anonymous crowd plate, the one dated November 19, 1863. She knew exactly what that date meant. And instead of accepting the label, she asked a sharper question. If this was taken at Gettysburg on Dedication Day, where would Lincoln be? Watch what she did next, because it was genuine detective work. She studied the placement of the people. She noticed a slight elevation near the center left of the frame, a cluster of figures raised above the crowd, exactly where a speaker's platform would be. She watched where the heads were turned, where the crowd's attention was, flowing. Every line of sight in that photograph pointed toward one spot. So, Cobb made a bet. If the crowd was looking there, the president was there. If stories like this are why you are here, take 2 seconds and subscribe, because this channel digs into exactly this kind of buried history every week. And the second half of this photograph's story is stranger than the first. Then she enlarged that section of the plate, and out of the grain, a face resolved. Long, gaunt, instantly familiar. Cobb froze over the image, checking it again and again before she let herself believe what her own enlargement was showing her. A hatless Abraham Lincoln, head bare, probably seated, caught in the middle of the crowd he was about to address. Near him, Cobb identified his bodyguard Ward Hill Lamon and Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin. Based on who was present and who had not yet arrived, she estimated the photograph was taken around noon, roughly 3 hours before Lincoln stood and delivered the address. Sit with that for a second. For 89 years, the answer had been in a box, not lost in an attic, not buried in a battlefield, filed, cataloged under a label that told everyone there was nothing to see. The only known photograph of Lincoln at Gettysburg survived not because anyone protected it, but because nobody knew enough about it to throw it away. Cobb's identification made her reputation, and it remains the closest thing humanity has to a visual record of the Gettysburg Address. If you look at the enlargement today, held by the National Archives, you can find him about an inch below the third flag from the left. A president reduced to a smudge of silver on glass, hiding inside his own archive for nearly a century. And the moment that face resolved out of the blur, every other face in the frame turned into a question that historians would spend the next 70 years fighting over. What the frame held. Once Cobb found Lincoln, the photograph transformed. Every blurry figure around him became a mystery. Who else was on that platform? Over the decades, scholars have proposed that the figures near Lincoln include his private secretaries John Hay and John Nicolay, the orator Edward Everett, who spoke for 2 full hours before Lincoln's 2 minutes, and David Wills, the Gettysburg attorney who organized the entire dedication and invited Lincoln almost as an afterthought. Think about that context. Lincoln was not the headline act at Gettysburg. Everett was. The president was asked to deliver a few appropriate remarks after the main oration. The photograph Cobb decoded captures the quiet before that moment. A crowd gathering at midday, boys loitering in the foreground, with no idea they were standing inside one of the most consequential afternoons in the country's history. A separate image from that day, widely attributed to a young photographer named David Bachrach, gives the clearest confirmed view of Lincoln on the platform, and researchers have used it as a reference map ever since, cross-checking positions and faces against it like a key. Even that image carries its own layer of revision, because at least one identification once accepted around Lincoln, a figure long marked as his bodyguard, Lamon, has since been re-argued by researchers as his secretary Nicolay. The platform keeps getting relabeled, face by face, more than a century and a half after the shutter opened. This is not settled history gathering dust. This is an open case file. And here is what almost nobody watching this realizes. Brady's team was not the only camera crew at Gettysburg that day. Another photographer was working that crowd from a different angle, and his plates were carrying a secret of their own. The stereo ghosts. His name was Alexander Gardner, and his history with Brady matters. Gardner had been Brady's most talented operator, the man who actually ran Brady's Washington Gallery, while Brady's failing eyesight kept him behind a desk, taking the credit. Gardner eventually walked out, set up his own studio, took several of Brady's best photographers with him, and made a point of doing something Brady rarely did. He credited the individual camera operator on each image. By November 1863, the 2 men were open competitors, and both understood that the cemetery dedication at Gettysburg was worth capturing. Gardner shot Gettysburg using a technique that was cutting edge in 1863, the stereograph. 2 lenses, side by side, exposing 2 nearly identical images at the same instant. Viewed through a handheld stereoscope, the pair fused into a 3-dimensional scene, an early ancestor of virtual reality that Victorian families kept in their parlors. The best views were mass-produced and sold to the public. Gardner exposed stereo views of the Gettysburg crowd from an elevated position. And just like the Brady plate, those images sat for generations, treated mostly as atmosphere rather than evidence. Then, in 2007, A man named John Richter did what Josephine Cobb had done half a century earlier. He magnified. Richter, an amateur historian and the director of the Center for Civil War Photography, was at his screen working through Gardner's Gettysburg views when something deep in the crowd stopped him cold. Far into the frame, he found a tall figure on horseback wearing a stovepipe hat, appearing to salute as troops passed. The figure was tiny, a few dozen pixels of history, but the shape was uncanny. The height, the hat, the posture. Richter identified the rider as Abraham Lincoln. The claim electrified Civil War photography circles. If Richter was right, the world had gone from 0 photographs of Lincoln at Gettysburg to 2 in the space of 55 years, both of them hiding inside images everyone already had access to. Nothing new had been dug up. Someone had simply looked closer, but that identification would not survive unchallenged. Because a man who had spent his career animating faces for Disney was about to open the very same plates, and what he found there did not match Richter's Lincoln at all. The animator zooms in. Christopher Oakley was a professional animator before he became a professor at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. He had spent years at Disney studying how faces are built, how a jawline catches light, how a brow sits over the eyes. In the 2000s, he launched the Virtual Lincoln Project, an effort to create a meticulous 3-dimensional digital recreation of Lincoln delivering the Gettysburg Address, built with his students. To populate his digital platform with the right faces, Oakley needed to identify the dignitaries seated around Lincoln, so he went into Gardner's stereo plates, enlarging section by section. Along the way, using a newer scan, he even proposed that a figure in the foreground was Alexander Gardner himself, supervising while an associate operated the camera. And then, in the right half of Gardner's first stereo view, in a gray blur of crowd, he spotted a profile he recognized, a distinctive, hawk-like face that matched William Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State. Oakley superimposed a known portrait of Seward over the blurred figure and toggled between them. The alignment was striking. That set off an alarm in his head. From the confirmed backrack image, Oakley knew Seward sat near Lincoln on the platform. Find Seward, and the president should be close by. Here is where the story turns on $73. Oakley wondered whether the Library of Congress, which holds the Gardner negatives, had ever produced a high-resolution scan of the other side of the stereo pair. They had not. For a fee of $73, they made one. Oakley later said it was the best money he ever spent, because the moment he had that scan, the crowd sharpened into individuals. In a follow-up plate, Gardner exposed from the same elevated spot, partially obscured by varnish flaking off the back of the glass. Oakley found what he was looking for. Near the Seward profile stood the vague outline of a bearded figure in a stovepipe hat, head tilted downward. Oakley took a high-resolution Lincoln portrait made just days before Gettysburg, scaled it, rotated it to match the downward angle, and overlaid it on the figure. By his account, every landmark lined up: jawline, beard, hair, cheekbones, heavy brow, ears. He was now convinced he had found Lincoln in Gardner's plates. But his Lincoln was not Richter's Lincoln. 2 figures in 2 different places, and both could not be the president. One of these identifications had to die, and Oakley was about to take Richter's famous horseback rider apart, piece by piece. 3 Lincolns. Oakley went at the rider with an animator's eye for detail. The enhanced scans showed the figure wearing a coat, with what appeared to be military-style epaulets on the shoulders, while eyewitness accounts described Lincoln in a plain overcoat that day. Oakley also argued the rider's beard and hair ran too long and full for Lincoln in November 1863, and he saw no clear mourning band on the hat, which Lincoln wore in that period after the death of his son Willie. In Oakley's reading, the famous rider was not Lincoln at all, just another man on a horse. Now, flip the board, because Richter's side did not fold. Defenders of the horseback identification pushed back hard, and they aimed straight at Oakley's anchor point. His entire chain of logic hangs on that hawk-like profile being William Seward. Skeptics argued the profile could belong to someone else entirely, with one researcher proposing Simon Cameron, the Pennsylvania politician who had earlier served as Lincoln's Secretary of War and had recently returned from a diplomatic posting in Russia. If that face is Cameron and not Seward, Then Oakley's method of using Seward to locate Lincoln collapses, and his top-hatted figure becomes just another bearded man in a crowd full of them. They also pointed to the confirmed Bachrach view, arguing that Lincoln sat front and center with Seward positioned to his left, in an arrangement that does not comfortably match where Oakley placed his candidates in the Gardner frame. There is even a third camp in this debate, the quiet skeptics who suspect that Gardner's crowd views were never meant to feature Lincoln at all. In their reading, these were establishing shots, wide views taken to set the scene, the 19th century equivalent of B-roll, and every proposed Lincoln inside them is simply a pattern our eyes are desperate to complete. Every enlargement is a Rorschach test with a top hat, and the smaller the face, the more certain everyone seems to become. So, the board now holds at least 3 proposed Lincolns spread across the Gettysburg plates. Cobb's hatless seated figure in the Brady image, which remains the identification with the broadest acceptance. Richter's saluting rider. Oakley's downward-gazing man in the stovepipe hat. Serious, careful researchers have stared at the same grains of silver and walked away certain of contradictory things. The dispute is not archived. It is live, being re-argued right now. Which of these Lincolns, if any, survives scrutiny? That question is still open. Still hiding. But notice what all 3 claims share. Nobody found a new photograph. Every discovery from 1952 to 2007 to 2013 came from images that had been publicly held for generations. The evidence was never missing. The looking was. And that is the thought that should follow you out of this video. The Brady collection alone contains thousands of plates. Gardner left thousands more. The Library of Congress and the National Archives together hold an ocean of 19th century glass, and only a fraction of it has ever been examined at modern resolution. Researchers have spent entire careers rereading images everyone thought were understood, matching terrain in the backgrounds, identifying which battlefield photographs were staged, tracing which bodies and props appear in multiple frames. Every few years, someone magnifies a familiar image and finds a person history forgot to record, and every time it happens, an entire chapter of the past quietly gets rewritten. Josephine Cobb proved that a president can hide inside his own government's filing system for nearly 90 years. Richter and Oakley proved that even after a photograph becomes famous, it can still be holding secrets, and that 2 honest experts can study the same plate and find 2 different Lincolns. Somewhere in those archives right now, there is almost certainly another mislabeled plate, another face nobody has matched, another noon hour from the 1860s waiting for someone to ask the right question of it. So, the question this whole story leaves behind is simple. How much of history is actually lost, and how much is just unexamined? If you had access to those archives, which image would you zoom into first, and what do you think is still hiding in those crowds? Drop your answer in the comments because we read them and they shape what we investigate next. And if you have not already, hit subscribe and check out the video on your screen right now, where we dig into another piece of history that was never supposed to surface.